Old Grognard says, let's learn how firearms work in AD&D 2nd Edition's Combat and Tactics book. I'm going to start this video by attempting to answer a question, and that question is, why do I prefer how firearms are presented in Combat and Tactics versus how they're presented in other 2nd Edition materials like the PHB, Forgotten Realms Adventures, or Spelljammer? Combat and Tactics presents its firearms rules as being completely optional and not tied to any particular setting. The option of using gunpowder or smoke powder is presented to the DM, and the firearms are broken down by ignition system type, like Matchlock, Wheellock, Flintlock, etc. This allows you to customize the rules to work towards conveying the type of setting you would like to run. So, if you're into pike and shot warfare, you can make wheellocks and matchlocks be the primary firearms for your setting. If you want to do flintlocks and fireballs, you can have flintlocks be your primary and maybe have wheellocks as your ancient magic item type firearms. My point is that it's set up as a world building tool totally in the hands of the DM and not as a must-have rules supplement that you have to use or else. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start with the basic rules for firearms as they are in the book. There's a compiled list of firearms on page 126, along with consumables to make them work. The accompanying text is in regards to which propellant you want to use in your setting, that is, gunpowder or smoke powder. The text is straightforward enough that I'll just read it rather than trying to paraphrase. Gunpowder is a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Generally, it is available only in low magic campaigns. If gunpowder is widely available in a given setting, firearms will naturally be more common. If the DM rules that gunpowder works in his campaign, it can be purchased at the listed cost. In a realistic setting, gunpowder is cheap and easy to obtain. Smoke powder is a magical compound that duplicates the effects of gunpowder. If the DM wishes to have firearms in his campaign, but wants to limit their availability, he can decide that normal gunpowder doesn't work. Smoke powder is much scarcer and more expensive than regular gunpowder, and player characters will usually have to find some instead of being able to buy it. Of course, if the DM wants no guns of any kind in his campaign, he can rule that neither gunpowder nor smoke powder work in his world. Without powder, guns are useless. There's a fourth option not listed in the book, which is to have both gunpowder and smoke powder available in your setting. I'll explain how that can work when I get to the house rules section of this video, but for now, let's go to pages 136 and 137 and look at the rules for using firearms in-game. And this time I will paraphrase what they have to say. Right away, they reiterate that firearms are optional. Then they let us know that the groups of firearms listed represent arms technology improving over time, and we'll see that in greater detail when we look at the individual weapon types. Next, firearms have three unusual properties. The first is that they are subject to misfires. If an attack roll made with a firearm is low enough to trigger a misfire, the DM rolls 2d6 and consults the misfire table on page 136, which looks like this. On a 2 or a 3, the explosion result means the firearm explodes. This destroys the weapon, and the firer must make a saving throw versus death. If successful, they take 1d6 damage, or 2d6 on a failed save. On a 4 through 7, the weapon is fouled, and cannot be used again until it is thoroughly cleaned. This takes between 10 and 30 minutes. On a roll of 8 to 12, the hangfire result means the weapon discharges 1 to 3 rounds later than it should. If the firer holds the weapon on target, they can roll another attack roll when the weapon finally discharges. It doesn't say this in the description, but it would be possible to roll yet another one and then have to roll on the misfire table again. I'd count it as a regular miss just to keep the game from getting bogged down, but how that works is up to the DM. The next unusual property of firearms is the ability to ignore armor, unless the weapon's description says otherwise. At close range, firearms ignore any armor class bonuses that are derived from armor or shields. AC from dexterity, cover, or magical protection works normally. At medium range, they ignore 5 points of armor in this fashion, and they ignore 2 points at long range. This is the example the book gives on page 136. For example, a renegade knight in plate mail +3 is fired upon by the King's Musketeers. Normally, his AC is a base 0. A short-range musket shot ignores the 7-point AC reduction provided by plate mail, and only the knight's +3 is considered. The renegade knight is AC 7. At medium range, the armor is not completely ignored, but the base AC of 3 is reduced to 8. Magic adjusts this to AC 5. At long range, the knight is AC 2 against musket fire. The last of the 3 unusual features is open-ended damage, and this also applies to firearms unless the weapon's description says otherwise. How this works in combat and tactics is that all firearms that have open-ended damage have a D8 for their knockdown die. If a 7 or 8 is rolled on the knockdown die, you roll the knockdown die and the damage die again and add the damage die to the damage total. If the knockdown die rolls a 7 or 8 again, you repeat the process. So what this does is it gives us a 25% chance to get another damage die each time we roll for damage. I've never used the knockdown die and have yet to meet anyone who does. So if you don't use the knockdown die, you can use the method from earlier publications and have rollover damage happen when the damage die rolls max damage. Or, the method I prefer is to roll a d4 alongside the damage die, with its only purpose being that you get to do rollover damage if it rolls a 4. I use a d4 for this because it's easy to distinguish from your damage die, since none of the firearms that have open-ended damage use a d4, and we still get the 25% chance to do more damage like we do with the knockdown die. Now that we know the general rules for firearms, let's look at the weapon types shown on page 126. We're not just going to look at the specific game rules for each, but go a bit more in depth with pictures of what they look like and how they function at a basic level. This is so that we can answer questions players might have and be able to describe what's going on from a narrative point of view. The first group we'll look at are hand match weapons. I don't have a picture of the hand match arquebus, but the handgun looks like this over here. As you can see, there's no trigger mechanism. The firer uses a slow match to fire the weapon by hand. Rules as written, hand match weapons don't have open-ended damage or the ability to ignore armor. They also misfire on an unmodified attack roll of 5 or less, which is increased to 10 or less in wet conditions. The other downside of hand match weapons is that they double their range penalties to -4 at medium range and -10 at long. I've never had hand match weapons in a game, but if I did, I would give them at least some armor ignoring ability, like maybe 5 points at close range and 2 at medium. I would also give them a small chance of open-ended damage as well, allowing them to roll again and add to the damage total if they roll max damage, the way that the arquebus works in the PHB. This way there would be a reason for them to exist and be used, and things like orcs with handguns attacking the player characters, but occasionally blowing themselves up just sounds like fun. The next refinement of the firearm, as far as we're concerned, would be the matchlock. For weapons in game, we have the arquebus, which looks like this, and here's a drawing of one being carried just to get an idea of the size. If you look here, you can see the slow match in the guy's other hand. This is the caliver, which was like a scaled down musket that was mostly used for hunting, and then finally the musket with rest, which looks like this, and we also saw it earlier with the bit about the King's Musketeers and the Renegade Knight. The matchlock is named after its firing mechanism. The slow match is placed into this piece here, called the serpentine, and when the trigger is squeezed, it lowers into this part here called the pan. The pan is full of powder, so it ignites, and some of the flash goes through a small hole into the barrel and ignites the main charge. In game terms, the matchlock misfires on an unmodified attack roll of 3 or less. Other things a DM might consider is that the slow match makes it difficult for characters to hide or sneak around in the dark, which might even be more of a problem in a world where infravision is common. After the matchlock, we move on to the wheellock. The weapons we have in-game are the arquebus, which is basically the wheellock version of the weapon from earlier, the belt pistol, which looks like this, and the horse pistol, which, although it could be carried as a personal weapon, was often carried in pairs in saddle-mounted holsters. The wheellock firing mechanism works something like a modern butane lighter, with the wheel spinning and throwing sparks to ignite powder in a pan that in turn ignites the main charge like we saw earlier with the matchlock. When the firing mechanism is primed, the wheel is wound with a spanner, which looks like this if anyone was wondering. For game terms, the book doesn't list a misfire number for the wheellock. There's a typo where instead of giving us a footnote for misfire, we have the footnote for polearms that can be set to receive charge. But the description of the snaplock says that snaplocks are more prone to misfires than wheellocks, and the snaplock misfires on a roll of 2 or less. This allows us to infer that wheellocks misfire on an attack roll of a natural 1. And so, speaking of the snaplock, that's where we go next. In-game, for snaplock weapons, we have the belt pistol, horse pistol, and musket. These weapons have roughly the same shape and form as the earlier matchlock and wheellock weapons of the same type. The snaplock mechanism is the ancestor of what we now know as a flintlock. An example in the real world would be the snafonce if you want to look up examples for yourself. The main difference between a snaplock and a true flintlock is that this piece here, called the striker plate, and the pan cover here are 2 different pieces. On some snaplocks, the pan cover opens automatically. On others, the pan has to be opened manually, like it is on most matchlocks. Either way, the weapon ignites the powder charge in the pan by striking the flint here against the striker plate to generate sparks. In game terms, as we learned earlier, snaplocks misfire on an unmodified roll of 2 or less on their attack roll. Now let's look at the last and most advanced ignition type covered in combat and tactics, and that would be the flintlock. There are quite a few weapons listed in-game under the heading of flintlock. We have the belt pistol, blunderbuss pistol, carbine, horse pistol, and musket. At this point, the musket has evolved into the weapon we usually think of when we hear the word musket. The belt pistol and horse pistol are updated versions of the earlier weapons, and the carbine is basically a short musket for shooting from horseback. The blunderbuss and blunderbuss pistols are large-bore weapons made for firing multiple pieces of shot rather than one single projectile, and are sort of like a modern shotgun in that respect. The flintlock firing mechanism works by striking the flint against this part, called the frizzen. It acts as a combination pan cover and striker plate, and automatically opens when the weapon is fired. Once the powder in the pan ignites, it works pretty much like previous weapons. In game terms, flintlocks misfire only when a natural 1 is rolled on the attack roll, They otherwise work like the other firearms listed so far, with the exception of the blunderbuss and blunderbuss pistol. They have their own special rules, so let's take a look at how these work. There are two things to keep in mind with the blunderbuss and its pistol counterpart. The first is that unlike most other firearms in game, blunderbusses do not get open-ended damage. The other is that they function differently depending on range. At close range, the blunderbuss can be used to attack a single target. We resolve this action by rolling a d4, and the result is how many individual attack rolls we make against the target. At medium range, instead of choosing a single target, the firer chooses a 3-foot radius centered on a spot of their choosing, and gets to roll one attack each against 1d3 targets within that area of effect. Long range works in a similar fashion, except this time it's a 5-foot radius, and the firer gets to roll 1d2 minus 1, or 0 to 1 attacks each, against any number of targets within the area of effect. For purposes of figuring out if the weapon misfires, just use the first attack roll, and if a 1 is rolled on any after the first, they just miss. It doesn't say that in the book, but that's what makes sense to me, so that's what I suggest. The last group of weapons listed under firearms are combination weapons. Combination weapons use the stats listed when used in melee, and function as wheellock belt pistols when used as firearms. Combination weapons exist that use other ignition systems, like this Flintlock axe pistol, for instance. If you wanted Flintlock axe pistol in your game, you would change the firearm part to use the stats of a Flintlock belt pistol, and then adjust the price by the difference between the two, or to whatever you feel would be appropriate. So now it's time for some house rules. The first house rule we'll talk about is, what if you want to have both gunpowder and smoke powder in game? So my guiding principle on this is that smoke powder should have properties that make it worth its cost. The one I've used is that the misfire number is lowered by 1, and smoke powder makes projectiles fired with it able to hit creatures that require a +1 or better weapon to hit them. You might do something different, or have fun with it, and have stuff like smoke powder that has effects determined by color. Maybe green smoke powder causes bullets to do acid damage in addition to normal effects. I don't know. Like I said, have fun with it. The next house rule item that might come up is, what about silver bullets? In games where I have firearms, bullets always weigh 16 to a pound, or 1 ounce each. This makes them 0.662 inches in diameter, or just a hair smaller than a paintball. If you were to make a pound of silver bullets the same size, a pound of silver would make 17 bullets with a little bit left over at the end. How much silver this is money-wise depends on how much coins weigh in your game, and if the players want to buy silver bullets, charge like 5 times the value of the silver for them, because labor and guilds or something. The last house rule I want to talk about is rifling. For those that don't know, rifling is a series of spiral grooves cut inside the barrel of a firearm that imparts spin on bullets fired from them. This causes the projectile to spin at literally thousands of revolutions per minute and become aerodynamically stable. This has 3 effects in game, 2 positive and 1 detrimental. The 2 positives are that in game terms the weapon's medium and long range attack roll penalties are reduced to -1 at medium range and -3 at long range. The long range of the weapon is also increased by 50%. The downside is that the weapon's rate of fire is reduced by 1 level, and here's a chart to explain how that works. This is because rifling makes it harder to force projectiles down the barrel, to the point that with early rifled weapons, they literally had to hammer the end of the ramrod to get projectiles to seat all the way. Rifled weapons should cost at least twice as much as normal and require a gunsmith with appropriate tools for it to be done correctly. In the real world, spiral groove rifling appeared around the year 1500, so there are examples of most of the weapons listed here with rifling, except for blunderbusses and hand-match weapons. Okay, that covers rules for firearms in the Combat and Tactics book, as well as some of the house rules I wanted to share. So, here's a list of page numbers if you want to look this stuff up for yourself. And while you're looking at that, I'd like to thank everyone who watches this channel. If it wasn't for you, I'd just be a weirdo over here talking to myself. Alright, it's outro time. Bebonimus P. Catsworth and I would like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day.